Picture it, a routine speeding ticket, until the young man in front of Judge Caprio smiled, and the room went strangely quiet. Everyone knew he wasn't just any driver. He was the son of a Providence powerhouse. Paper rustled like dry leaves. The clock ticked loud enough to count nerves. A camera from the city feed framed Caprio's face, calm, attentive, watchful. Across the room, a 24-year-old stood in a tailored suit that fit like a resume. He carried himself with the assurance of someone who had never waited long for a table. "Judge Caprio," he said, smile trimmed to courtroom size. "I know the law better than most here. My father is Robert Hale, senior partner at Hale and Partners. I'm sure we can resolve this without unnecessary formalities." Caprio set his pen down and regarded him over the rim of his glasses. "This isn't we, Mr. Hale. This is court, and the law doesn't change to fit a last name." A look passed through the gallery, recognition, curiosity, a faint trace of satisfaction. The bailiff shifted his stance. A woman in the second row folded her hands tighter in her lap. The defendant kept smiling, but the corners of his mouth started to think twice. The officer misfiled the citation. The young man continued. "I have proof. Dashcam footage that completely clears me." He lifted a small drive like a key to a simpler door. Caprio nodded once. "Let's see it." The screen warmed to life. Headlights, wet asphalt, the metronome flash of traffic signals. The footage jumped, clip to clip, a neat sequence of relevant moments. The sound was thin, the cuts were not. A gap here, a sudden angle change there, as if the camera had learned to blink only when convenient. Whispers stirred. The clerk glanced up, then back to the monitor. Caprio didn't move, only his eyes sharpened. "Interesting," he said after a beat. "Mr. Hale, did you edit this video yourself?" "Yes," he answered smoothly, "but only to make it easier to review." Caprio's expression didn't change, yet the temperature seemed to drop a degree. "I'm not convinced of either point, and I suspect you aren't either." The young man's confidence slipped the width of a thread. He clasped his hands, unclasped them, found nowhere to put them that didn't look like theater. Caprio closed the case file partway, as if bracing it against wind. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "We're going to pause while I read the officer's report again." Silence gathered in the pews. The judge skimmed, then slowed, then read line by line. Fluorescence hummed. Somewhere near the back, a phone buzzed and died under a quick palm. Finally, he looked up. The room leaned forward without moving. "I don't care for hurried conclusions," Caprio said, measured and plain. "But it appears this is not merely about a ticket." He slid the file aside and rested both hands on the bench. Sometimes the smallest thing, a missing second of video, a smile at the wrong moment, tells the longest story. Let's make sure we're hearing the right one. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. To understand why the son of a lawyer stood in front of a judge, you had to know who he was outside those walls. Nicholas Hale, 24, second-year law student at Boston University, raised on privilege and precision. His father, Robert Hale, built a reputation that could silence rooms and sway juries with a single raised eyebrow. His son inherited that same confidence. Only the conviction was borrowed. Nick grew up in a house where conversation sounded like depositions. Praise came in clauses, affection in verdicts. "You win, or you explain why you didn't," his father used to say. Somewhere between scholarships and expectations, Nick learned that truth mattered less than proof. In the courtroom, Judge Caprio's voice was steady but probing. "You said earlier you know the law. Tell me, Mr. Hale, what is the law to you? An instrument or a conscience?" Nick straightened, searching for the safest answer. "Both, sir." Caprio's brow lifted, faintly. "And that's precisely the problem. For me, it's only the second." The room absorbed the sentence like cold air. Even Nick's confident posture faltered. The judge turned a page. "Interesting. The officer who issued your citation once had dealings with your family." Nick frowned. "Dealings?" "Yes," Caprio said. "Officer Mendez was a client in a property dispute your father's firm handled years ago. A case he lost." A murmur ran through the gallery, people sensing a thread, pulling at it. Caprio's tone didn't accuse, but it carried weight. Some might call this coincidence. Others, retribution. Nick's mother sat 2 rows behind him, pale, lips pressed together. She'd come quietly, without notice. When Caprio's gaze met hers, She looked as if she might speak, then stopped. Something unspoken hovered between them, a truth deferred. "Mr. Hale," the judge said finally, "would you step outside for a moment?" Confused, Nick hesitated, then obeyed. When the door closed, Caprio turned toward the woman. "Ma'am," he said gently, "this isn't only about a speeding ticket, is it?" Her voice trembled, careful as glass. "No, Your Honor. My son isn't like his father. He just got lost trying to be him." Caprio studied her, eyes softened by the weight of what he'd seen too often, ambition mistaken for love. "Thank you, ma'am." Moments later, Nick was called back in. The judge waited until he stood before him again. "Mr. Hale," he said evenly, "I'm giving you a chance most people never get. To tell the truth. Not the legal version, the human one. Because if you lie again, not even your father's name will protect you." Nick's throat tightened. For the first time, he didn't look like the son of anyone. He looked like a boy standing in a storm he'd built himself. He took a breath. The clock ticked once, loud in the silence. I wasn't alone that night," he said. The words fell heavy, unpolished, but real. And in the quiet that followed, every eye in the room understood. The story had just changed. The silence lasted longer than any argument. The kind that makes people aware of their own breathing. Judge Caprio folded his hands, his expression unreadable. "Continue, Mr. Hale." Nick's voice was low, stripped of its usual confidence. "I wasn't alone. I was driving a friend home. He'd been drinking a lot. I didn't want him behind the wheel, so I took his keys. I thought I was doing the right thing." Caprio nodded slightly, but his eyes stayed sharp. "And yet you ended up here. How does a good deed turn into a courtroom appearance?" Nick swallowed. "Because I panicked. The light turned red, and he started vomiting. I was trying to pull over, but the lane was blocked. So I ran the light. Just for a second. Then the sirens came. I didn't want it to look bad. I told the officer I was alone, and I edited the footage to match that story." Caprio's voice softened but lost none of its gravity. "You didn't lie about the law, Mr. Hale. You lied to protect your image. You wanted to be the hero in your own narrative." Nick's throat constricted. "I didn't want people to think I was like my father." Before Caprio could respond, the bailiff entered quietly and handed him a note. The judge unfolded it, read, then raised his eyes to the officer seated in the back. "Officer Mendez, please step forward." The man approached, steady, calm, his badge catching the light. "Tell us what you saw that night." Mendez cleared his throat. He wasn't speeding at first, but when the light turned red, he accelerated. "I followed. When I approached the vehicle, the passenger was unconscious, slumped against the door. Smelled like whiskey." The courtroom shifted uneasily. "I called for medical backup," Mendez continued. "While waiting, I checked the trunk, standard procedure when I saw the broken glass on the floor. There were bottles. At least a dozen, some open." Gasps rippled through the room. Nick's mother covered her mouth, eyes wet. Caprio leaned back, quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Hale," he said finally, "do you realize what could have happened if someone had crossed that intersection?" Nick didn't look up. "Yes, sir." "No," Caprio said. "You understand the risk, but you don't feel it. If you did, you wouldn't have tried to make the video look clean." Nick's shoulders trembled slightly, though he fought to keep his composure. Caprio looked at him over his glasses. "Where is your father today?" Nick hesitated. "In New York. Business meetings." "He knows about this?" A pause. "He said he was too busy. He told me to handle it myself." Caprio nodded slowly. "And still, you tried to be him." Nick's eyes flickered. "I just wanted him to be proud of me," he whispered. The judge's expression softened for a heartbeat, then hardened again. "You tried to earn your father's respect by doing exactly what made him lose mine years ago, hiding behind the law instead of facing it." The gallery was silent, a room full of people holding their judgment behind pursed lips. Caprio took off his glasses and placed them carefully on the bench. "Mr. Hale, the worst kind of deceit isn't the one that fools others. It's the one that convinces you you're still honorable." Nick's gaze dropped to the table. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." "I believe that," Caprio said. "But intent doesn't erase consequence. You're lucky no one's name had to follow yours onto a headstone." The words struck like the last echo of a gavel, even though none had fallen. Caprio closed the file with deliberate calm. "We'll adjourn until tomorrow morning. And when we return, we won't speak of statutes or evidence." He stood, robe folding like a curtain between worlds. Tomorrow, we'll talk about something rarer in court than truth itself. Nick looked up, eyes hollow, voice barely audible. What's that? Caprio turned at the door. Honor. The judge left first, the sound of his footsteps fading against marble. Nick sat motionless, the weight of the word lingering long after the room emptied. Honor, a concept that no edit, no argument, no surname could disguise. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. People sensed something was about to happen. Caprio never postponed a case without reason. The air buzzed with quiet expectancy. Even the walls seemed to listen. Nick Hale walked in, posture stiff, face pale but composed. His suit was pressed, his jaw clenched, yet his eyes betrayed the sleepless night behind them. In the first row sat his parents. His mother looked hollowed, her hands folded in her lap like a fragile truce. Beside her, Robert Hale, one of the most feared attorneys in Providence, stared straight ahead, neither smiling nor acknowledging his son. For once, power didn't sit comfortably on him. Judge Caprio adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Nick. Mr. Hale, he said, voice low but sharp enough to pierce through the murmur. New evidence was submitted this morning. Footage from the city's surveillance system. Unedited. Authentic. Nick's breath caught. We will review it together, Caprio continued. Because the truth has a way of resurfacing when we try too hard to bury it. The lights dimmed slightly. The video played. The screen showed the same intersection, the night Nick had described. Rain glimmered on the pavement. His car stopped, hazard lights flashing. He stepped out, opening the passenger door, trying to lift his half-conscious friend. The crowd leaned in, tension softening. For a moment, Nick looked like the hero he had claimed to be. Then came the next frame. He glanced around, nervous, then opened the trunk and began hiding bottles, one after another, while the police lights approached in the distance. Gasps spread through the room. Whispers swelled like static. Caprio let it play until the end, then turned the screen off. He looked at Nick with a quiet that felt heavier than anger. I see a man standing between good and fear, he said slowly. And you chose fear. Nick's lips parted, but no sound came. Before he could speak, his father rose abruptly. Judge, my son is not obligated to answer that question without counsel. Caprio's gaze didn't waver. You're welcome to sit beside him, Mr. Hale. But not as counsel, as a father. And as such, you will remain silent. The room froze. The elder Hale hesitated, then sat down again, shoulders rigid, mouth pressed thin. For the first time in his career, he looked powerless. Nick's voice broke the stillness. You think I wanted to hide that? He turned toward the judge, eyes bright with exhaustion. You think I'm proud of it? I didn't care about the bottles. I cared about him. He jabbed a finger toward his father without realizing it. If he'd found out I was out that night saving a drunk friend instead of working at his firm, he'd have called me weak. The outburst cracked through the room like thunder. The gallery went silent again. Even Robert Hale seemed to shrink a little, the fight draining from his face. Caprio leaned forward, elbows on the bench. And now, finally, he said quietly, you've told the truth. Not to me, but to yourself. Nick's chest rose and fell in uneven waves. His mother reached for his hand, but he was staring at the table, dazed, as if realizing for the first time what he'd been running from. Caprio stood, gathering his papers, but his tone softened. Mr. Hale, I will deliver my ruling tomorrow, but I'm not sure a verdict is meant for you alone. He turned his eyes toward the front row. Some lessons belong equally to fathers and sons. Robert Hale looked down, unblinking, as if the words were stones placed carefully on his chest. When Caprio left the bench, no one moved. The audience sat in absolute stillness, the echo of truth still trembling in the air, because what they had witnessed wasn't a trial anymore. It was a reckoning. This time, the courtroom didn't hum with the usual restlessness. There was no nervous cough, no shuffle of papers, only a collective awareness that they were witnessing something more intimate than a trial. It felt less like a hearing and more like the slow unraveling of a family's truth. Judge Caprio entered quietly. His robe moved like a shadow across the floor, his face unreadable. We'll resume the case of Mr. Nicholas Hale, he said. But before we speak of judgment, I want to speak of perspective. He turned toward Officer Mendez, seated near the front. Officer, you were there that night. You saw more than a citation. Would you care to add anything before I close this record? Mendez rose, cap in hand. Yes, Your Honor. His voice was steady low. When I stopped that car, I didn't see a criminal. I saw a kid who reminded me of my own son. But when he smiled and said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it," I realized he wasn't afraid of the law. He was afraid of being ordinary. That's why I wrote the report to the last word. The room was still. Even Caprio seemed to let the moment breathe before speaking. Thank you, officer. That is exactly why we're here today. He paused, scanning the crowd before settling his gaze on the first row. Mr. Hale, Robert Hale, would you step forward, please? The elder Hale stood, stiff-backed, as though climbing a ladder built from his own pride. He took his place beside his son. Do you know, Caprio began, why your son is standing here, and not sitting comfortably in your firm, surrounded by partners who spend half their lives fixing what the other half destroys? Robert Hale didn't answer. His jaw clenched, his gaze locked on the polished wood of the bench. Caprio waited. The silence stretched thin as glass. Finally, the man exhaled. Because I taught him to win, he said softly. Not to be honest. A collective breath rippled through the courtroom. Nick's mother covered her face. Even the bailiff's posture softened. Caprio's tone deepened, more sorrow than reprimand. He didn't need an attorney, Mr. Hale. He needed a father. Someone who could show him that truth matters even when no one's watching. Robert nodded once, almost imperceptibly. For a man who built his life on control, it was the closest thing to surrender. The judge reached for the case file and flipped through it with slow precision. Nicholas Hale, he said finally, you will pay a fine of $5,000. Not for speeding, but for lying, to this court and to yourself. A stunned silence filled the chamber. A few exchanged glances, unsure whether it was mercy or punishment. Caprio continued, his voice even. This is not a penalty. It's a reminder. Truth has a price, and sometimes it's the only thing worth paying. Nick nodded, his expression solemn but lighter somehow, as though the weight of pretending had finally lifted. Caprio looked at the father, then the son, then the audience. I hope everyone here understands what we've seen. The law does not exist to humiliate or destroy. It exists to reflect, to hold up a mirror so we can't avoid what's staring back. Robert Hale turned to his son. For the first time, his gaze wasn't assessing, but human. His voice broke slightly when he said, I spent my life teaching people how to defend themselves. I never taught you how to stand alone. Nick looked at him, startled by the honesty, and managed a faint nod. The judge closed the file with finality. We are adjourned for today, he said. Return tomorrow for sentencing details. As Caprio rose, the gallery followed. The soft scrape of chairs filled the silence. Yet beneath it, something sacred lingered, the sense that justice had expanded beyond the case. It had reached into the quietest corner of human need, the yearning to be seen, not as guilty or innocent, but as someone still capable of redemption. When the gavel had fallen the previous day, people assumed the story was finished. But when Judge Caprio entered the courtroom that morning, he didn't stand behind the bench immediately. He sat, hands folded, eyes lowered. It was the kind of silence that meant something was still unresolved. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried through the room like the slow toll of a bell. You know, he began, I've seen hundreds of cases where people lied to avoid punishment, but very few where someone lied because they were desperate for love. Nick lifted his eyes. The words cut deeper than any sentence. Caprio removed his glasses, cleaning them carefully as he often did before something important. Mr. Hale, he said, looking at the young man directly, you are guilty, but not beyond hope. Do you know why? Nick shook his head. Because today, you did what most grown men never manage, the judge continued. You admitted that you were afraid of failure, of judgment, of your father's silence. That fear brought you here. But confession, that's what can take you out. The audience was motionless, caught in the sincerity of it. Even Robert Hale sat upright, no longer the master of the room, but a man stripped of armor. Then Caprio leaned forward. The court has decided something unusual. The $5,000 fine you owe will not go to the city. It will be transferred to a foundation that supports the children of lawyers who grew up without their father's warmth. You will help them avoid the path that brought you here. Nick blinked, trying to steady his breath. The decision wasn't about money. It was about meaning. The gallery began to stir, murmurs of approval. A few tears quickly brushed away. Caprio wasn't finished. You wanted your father to be proud, he said. Maybe now he can be, not because you won, but because you learned what victory really is. He turned his gaze toward Robert Hale. Mr. Hale, he said softly, you once taught the law as a weapon. Perhaps now you'll teach it as a mirror. The father rose slowly, his composure fragile. For a long moment, he looked at his son, really looked. Then, in a voice roughened by years of restraint, he said, I am proud of you, Nick, and ashamed of myself. No one moved. Even Caprio seemed to pause, letting the confession settle where words usually can't reach. Nick's mother began to cry openly, her relief echoing softly in the chamber. Caprio replaced his glasses and looked at them all. The law isn't punishment, he said. It's reflection. It shows us what we've become and what we can still be. He reached for his gavel, then stopped halfway. This case was never about a fine, or a red light, or a night gone wrong. It was about truth, how it hides, how it hurts, and how it heals. Then the sound came, one clean strike of wood on wood. Case closed. But no one stood immediately. The crowd sat in reverent silence, as though afraid that moving would break something delicate that had just been repaired. Nick turned to his father. They didn't shake hands. They didn't need to. A nod passed between them, acknowledgement, apology, and something like beginning. As they walked out, the November light poured through the courthouse doors, pale and forgiving. Reporters waited by the steps, cameras raised, but Nick didn't stop. He didn't speak. He simply walked past them, his mother beside him, his father a step behind. Outside, the city sounded different, less like noise, more like breath. And though no cameras rolled, though no verdict was broadcast, everyone who had sat in that courtroom would remember what they'd seen. A man who came seeking absolution from the law and found it, instead, in the mirror of justice itself.